The void stretched infinitely before them, an expanse of black punctuated by distant stars. Somewhere, out in that abyss, equations dictated the movements of celestial bodies with absolute precision. Gravity could be charted, physics calculated, probabilities measured. To the Xelvari Dominion, existence was a sequence of patterns, a grand equation waiting to be solved. But humans, they were a variable no one could predict. Captain Elias Vance stood at the edge of the viewing deck, gazing at the spiraling nebula, beyond the transparent panels. The UEF Magellan drifted in the void, a speck against the backdrop of galactic order, yet carrying the full weight of humanity's reputation. He had heard the whispers before their departure. Humans are erratic, reckless, dangerous, the Xelvari believed it. Hell, sometimes he believed it. Behind him, the soft chime of approaching footsteps broke the silence. Dr. Mara Ortega adjusted the visor on her neural uplink, scanning the latest diplomatic brief. The tension in her jaw was evident. She was here to keep him from doing something stupid. Not an easy task. The Dominion is calling this meeting an evaluation, she said, voice clipped, professional. They want to determine if humanity is fit to exist alongside them, or if we're a threat to galactic stability. Vance exhaled, crossing his arms. I assume we don't get to see their grading rubric. She didn't smile. Their entire civilization is built on predictive modeling, she continued. They don't fight wars, they don't need to. They calculate the likelihood of conflict before it happens and eliminate the variables. The words hung heavy between them. Elias knew what she wasn't saying. If the Xelvari saw humanity as an unsolvable problem, they wouldn't waste time with negotiations. They would erase them. The diplomatic vessel docked at Xelvari Prime was unlike anything humanity had constructed. Obsidian spires, impossibly symmetrical, pulsing with an eerie blue light. The architecture wasn't merely aesthetic, it was precise. Even their ships moved with a calculated rhythm, an eerie synchrony that sent a chill through the human delegation. Vance led the way down the docking ramp, flanked by Ortega and Commander Darius Holt, whose hand hovered close to his sidearm. No weapons were allowed during negotiations, but Vance knew better. Holt could kill a man with a plastic spoon if necessary. The Xelvari delegates stood in perfect formation, their elongated frames wrapped in shimmering cerulean robes. Their faces, smooth, expressionless plates of biosynthetic material, reflected only cold indifference. They were not organic in the way humans understood. The Xelvari were engineered, self-optimized, their every thought dictated by logic trees and probability matrices. The Dominion Arbiter, a towering figure of alabaster and silver, stepped forward. Humanity, it said, voice devoid of emotion. You are here because you are an anomaly. We will determine if you are an acceptable anomaly or if you must be corrected. A subtle, unspoken threat. Vance squared his shoulders, offering a diplomatic smile that held no warmth. He had played this game before. Humanity's unpredictability terrified them. He intended to make sure it stayed that way, and then, the universe, in true human fashion, threw chaos into the mix. A sharp alarm cut through the artificial silence. A Xelvari attendant whispered something in its superior's ear, and for the first time Vance saw it. Hesitation. A fraction of a second delay. An unanticipated event they had not foreseen. What just happened? Holt murmured under his breath. Ortega was already scanning her neural interface, fingers twitching as she accessed UEF intelligence reports. Her face went pale. Jesus Christ, she whispered. A human faction just hijacked a Xelvari diplomatic vessel. Vance felt the blood drain from his face. The Orion Syndicate, a rogue human group operating on the fringes of known space, smugglers, anarchists, and self-proclaimed revolutionaries. If they had attacked a Dominion ship, there was no way to explain it as an accident. The Xelvari Arbiter turned its gaze back to them. Your species lacks control, lacks order. This action only confirms our greatest concern. Holt's hand tightened into a fist. Ortega was already typing furiously, drafting explanations, damage control. but it wouldn't matter. To the Xelvari, humanity was no longer an unpredictable ally. They were an uncontrollable threat, and threats were not allowed to exist. The silence that followed was suffocating. The Xelvari delegates exchanged information through direct uplinks, their bioluminescent circuitry flickering with synchronized data exchanges. Ortega's voice was tight. They're calculating an optimal response strategy. Vance already knew what it would be: elimination. The Arbiter spoke. Your people will be given one opportunity to rectify this error. Deliver the transgressors to us, or we will assume humanity itself is responsible. And with those words, the Dominion's unshakable order had been disrupted, because the one thing they feared most had entered their perfect equation: chaos. The room felt colder now. The Xelvari delegates stood motionless, their impassive faces staring straight ahead. The atmosphere was thick with the weight of their silence, an eerie calm that only emphasized the storm about to come. Vance kept his eyes locked on the Arbiter, knowing that any sign of weakness could be his last. Your people have confirmed the threat, the Arbiter said, its voice devoid of anger, yet its presence was suffocating. The Orion Syndicate's actions were not sanctioned by your government. We have already established this. But in that moment it didn't matter whether the attack had been sanctioned. The Xelvari had already made their judgment. Nevertheless, the Arbiter continued, the consequences of your people's failure to ensure order will be far-reaching. Vance took a breath, steadying himself. We'll handle it, he said. The Syndicate is a rogue faction. They don't represent humanity's interests. Ortega was typing rapidly on her neural uplink, trying to gather as much information as possible on the hijacking. There's no way to predict where they're heading. We've never had this kind of intelligence on them before. Vance could feel the pressure mounting. The Xelvari had already calculated everything, except for the one thing they couldn't account for: humanity's unpredictability. We have been tasked with your species' observation, the Arbiter said, its words cutting through the tension, like a blade. We will determine if you are a threat to galactic order, and if we find that your people cannot be relied upon to operate in an orderly manner. The Arbiter's gaze flickered to the screens in the chamber, showing various Xelvari ships maneuvering in formation above them. We will act accordingly. In that moment, everything seemed to shift. The calculated piece of the Dominion was cracking, the undercurrent of fear now rising to the surface. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet Vance saw it in the way the Arbiter's gaze flickered, in the way the air seemed to press heavier against his chest. They were scared, but not of him. They were scared of humanity, of the unpredictable, variable that humanity represented, and that was the edge they needed. You underestimate us, Vance said, his voice quieter now but carrying a sharp edge. He saw the flicker of confusion in the Arbiter's eyes. You believe us to be erratic, a chaotic anomaly. Vance continued, feeling the surge of adrenaline pushing him forward. And perhaps we are. But it's that very chaos that will be the death of you if you don't listen. We're not like the species you've dominated before. We'll never fit into your equations. We'll never be something you can predict, and that terrifies you. The Arbiter's expression didn't change. It was a creature of logic, a being that thrived on control, order, and predictability. But for the first time since they had met, Vance could sense a shift, a tremor beneath the surface. If you believe that your unpredictability will protect you, the Arbiter said, its voice colder now, then we will see how you fare when we test that belief. The doors to the chamber slid open. A Xelvari technician entered swiftly, whispering something to the Arbiter in a series of quick, clipped tones. Vance didn't need to hear the conversation. The technician's sudden appearance was a sign that the next step was already in motion. And from the look in the Arbiter's eyes, he knew it wouldn't be good. The Arbiter nodded sharply. Your actions have escalated matters, Captain. Vance, we will now take the first step to see if humanity can indeed function in galactic society. With that, the room went dark. The lights dimmed to a faint, ominous hum. A cold wave of dread swept over the humans in the room. Ortega's fingers twitched, her neural interface scanning for incoming data. Holt's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm, though he knew better than to draw it. The Xelvari were making their move. The first ripple of unpredictability had begun to spread across the galaxy, and it was only just starting to spiral out of control. Outside the chamber, deep within the heart of Xelvari Prime, the Xelvari command center hummed with mechanical precision. The vast complex was an endless grid of screens, each one displaying streams of data, holographic projections of military assets, and the carefully calculated movements of various galactic forces. A dozen Xelvari technicians moved in unison, their bodies perfectly synchronized as they managed the Dominion's logistical network. They operated in complete silence, their minds linked through neural interfaces, processing millions of calculations per second. The room was a monument to the Xelvari's singular devotion to order, to rationality. Nothing was left to chance. But the moment the hijacking of the diplomatic vessel had occurred, the entire system had been shaken. The Xelvari Dominion did not handle chaos well. Varrock, a low-level scientist within the Dominion, stood apart from the rest. His gaze flicked across the data streams, watching the unpredictable patterns of human activity unfolding in real time. He had always admired humans for their ability to defy the expected. He had watched them from a distance for years, studied their behavior, their philosophy, their evolution. It was fascinating, and it terrified him. Varrock had spent years in secrecy, researching a potential way to manipulate the Xelvari's rigid belief in their own perfection. He had discovered that, while the Xelvari were undeniably brilliant, their worldview was one-dimensional. They could not evolve beyond their rigid constraints, but humanity was different. And now, with the unexpected hijacking of the Xelvari diplomatic vessel, Varrock saw an opportunity. He knew what had to be done. Vance felt a chill crawl up his spine as the lights flickered back on. The Xelvari arbiter turned back toward him. "The test has begun, Captain Vance. Your people's fate is in your hands." Suddenly, the screens around them lit up, displaying a complex web of shifting patterns and data. Vance's eyes narrowed. He could see it now, a countdown. The Xelvari were about to see just how unpredictable humanity could be. Ortega stepped forward, her voice trembling with urgency. "This isn't a test, Elias. They're launching a full-scale response. We don't have much time." The arbiter's voice rang out, cold and deliberate. "You have until the end of this cycle to respond. Otherwise, we will consider your species a threat to galactic order." Vance's mind raced. He had to make a decision. He had to move. And the clock was ticking. In that moment, he knew exactly what had to be done. The Xelvari would never expect him to choose the most illogical, the most chaotic option. And that was exactly why it would work. A clock ticked somewhere in the back of Vance's mind, a rhythmic drumbeat that drowned out everything else. The countdown loomed over them, a constant reminder that the Xelvari were watching, calculating, and preparing to act. They had given humanity one cycle to prove themselves. But what the Dominion failed to understand was that humans never played by someone else's clock. The ship's tactical holograms flickered, displaying shifting probabilities, military assets, and enemy fleet formations. Ortega was poring over the data feeds, her fingers dancing across her neural uplink, trying to predict the Dominion's next move. "It's bad," she muttered, voice tight. "The Xelvari fleet is already repositioning. They're not waiting for our answer. They're locking down strategic systems, preparing for a worst-case scenario." Holt exhaled sharply, his fingers drumming against the steel table. "They've already decided," he said. "This evaluation is just a formality. They're going to wipe us out unless we give them something to process that their models can't handle." Vance nodded. "Then we give them chaos." Ortega looked up from her display, eyes narrowing. "We don't have the firepower for an outright fight. If we make a wrong move, they'll see it as confirmation that we're a destabilizing force." Vance smirked. "Which is why we don't fight them conventionally. We make them fight themselves." Holt's brow furrowed. "Explain." Vance turned to the display, bringing up a model of Xelvari Prime. "The Dominion is built on absolute order. Their entire civilization functions like a machine. They don't handle internal conflict well because they don't have internal conflict. But we do. His fingers flicked through data streams highlighting Dominion command nodes. And we're going to introduce it. Ortega's eyes widened as the realization dawned on her. You want to disrupt their decision-making processes. Vance's smirk deepened. More than that. We introduce uncertainty into their systems. We force them to doubt their own models, make them question their predictions. If they can't trust their own calculations, their entire system collapses. Holt leaned forward, intrigued. And how exactly do we do that? Vance's voice dropped lower, his mind already forming the plan. We hack their predictive models, we overload their systems with false data, fabricated probability matrices, conflicting intelligence reports. We turn their greatest strength, their reliance on absolute logic, into their biggest weakness. Ortega hesitated. That would require an inside source. A beat of silence passed between them. Then a voice crackled over the ship's secured comms. I may be able to assist. The Xelvari scientist Varrock moved through the command corridors with a careful, calculated pace. Around him, other Xelvari worked in synchrony, their neural links transmitting silent streams of data between them. No words were needed. No emotions clouded their purpose. But Varrock had always been different. He had studied humans for years, fascinated by their erratic nature. Their unpredictability was not a flaw. It was an evolutionary advantage. And now, he would prove it. He reached the Dominion's neural core, a vast, pulsating construct of artificial intelligence nodes and bioorganic interfaces. It was the brain of the Dominion, where all strategic models were run, where every decision was calculated down to the smallest probability, and Varrock was about to introduce the first truly random variable into its system. He connected his neural uplink to the interface, feeding fabricated data streams directly into the Dominion's core. False fleet movements, simulated human strategies, contradictory intelligence reports. Every scenario he injected was designed to disrupt the core's ability to determine the correct course of action. The Dominion relied on absolute certainty. Now, it had none. Across the Dominion's fleets, chaos erupted. Tactical units began receiving conflicting orders. Some called for defensive formations, others for immediate engagement. Projections that had once predicted flawless victory were now riddled with inconsistencies. The AI-driven commanders hesitated, unsure of which path to follow. For the first time in centuries, the Xelvari did not know what to do. In the heart of the Dominion's command center, the Arbiter watched as the data streams fluctuated wildly. It could feel the fractures forming within the system, an error unlike anything it had encountered before. This is impossible, one of the Xelvari strategists murmured, its neural uplink flickering as it struggled to process the conflicting intelligence. The models, they are contradicting one another. This has never happened before. The Arbiter's synthetic eyes darkened. It turned toward the main display, where the UEF Magellan hovered on the periphery of the battle zone. This is their doing, it stated. Humanity has introduced disorder into our systems. The strategist hesitated. What is the correct response? And for the first time in its existence, the Arbiter had no answer. Back on the UEF Magellan, Ortega's neural interface lit up. It's working, she breathed. The Dominion's Central Command is in total disarray. Their ships are receiving contradictory orders. Their fleets are hesitating. Holt chuckled darkly. We just made an entire empire second-guess itself. But Vance wasn't smiling. Because this was the moment the Xelvari would panic. And a species that had never known uncertainty would react in the most dangerous way possible. The Dominion's neural core, now overwhelmed with unpredictability, began executing an emergency protocol, one designed to purge anomalies from the system. And the greatest anomaly of all? Humanity. Across the battlefield, the Xelvari fleet suddenly stopped hesitating. Instead, they shifted into an extermination formation. Their previous indecision had been overridden by one last failsafe. Destroy the unknown. Eliminate the unpredictable. Ortega's screen flickered. Oh hell, they're committing everything. They've abandoned traditional battle strategies. They're moving to eradicate us outright. Holt cursed. So much for making them doubt. Vance's mind raced. He had anticipated that the Xelvari might react aggressively, but this was something else entirely. They weren't just trying to neutralize a threat anymore, they were desperate, and desperate enemies made mistakes. Vance turned sharply. Then we make them think they've already lost. Ortega frowned. How? A grim smile formed on Vance's lips. By doing the one thing they never expect us to do. Across the Xelvari fleets, human distress signals began appearing. Not just from the Magellan, but from multiple points in space. Distorted transmissions, emergency beacons, urgent requests for aid. The Xelvari's predictive systems registered the signals as evidence of total human collapse. According to their calculations, the distress calls meant humanity was already defeated. Their warships began recalculating their approach, hesitating once more. And in that moment of hesitation, the real attack began. Holt's fleet emerged from the darkness of space, striking at the exposed Xelvari command centers, crippling their communications, further disrupting their ability to coordinate. Varrock's virus completed its final cycle, sending a final corrupted directive through the Dominion's neural network. Humanity is no longer the primary threat. The Xelvari fleets collapsed into disarray, some retreating, others turning against their own in confusion. And in the chaos, humanity slipped away, leaving behind an empire that now feared the one thing it could never understand, uncertainty. As the Magellan jumped into hyperspace, Vance leaned back, exhaling for the first time in what felt like hours. Ortega shook her head in disbelief. I can't believe that worked. Holt grinned. Never underestimate a little bit of chaos, Vance. Turned to the display, watching the Xelvari Dominion fracture before his eyes. They wanted to test us, he murmured. Now they'll never stop questioning what we're capable of. And that was the real victory. The stars blurred past as the UF Magellan cut through hyperspace, but the chaos they had left behind remained. The Xelvari fleets were scrambling, their ships caught in a maelstrom of malfunctioning orders and conflicting intelligence. They had overestimated humanity's predictability and had been forced into a state of blind reaction. But in that moment, the victory felt hollow, because victory was never truly guaranteed. The Magellan's comms crackled to life, the urgent voice of Ortega cutting through the silence. Vance, we've got a major problem. The Dominion's backup protocol has activated. They're coordinating a massive counteroffensive and it's already in motion. We're not just dealing with their fleets anymore. They've unleashed their ultimate weapon. Vance's breath caught. What the hell is that? Some kind of hyper-intelligent AI more advanced than anything we've encountered. It's designed to evaluate and neutralize unknown threats based on an unpredictable variable. It's calculating their next steps in real time, adjusting to every possible outcome. If we don't stop it before it enters the final phase, it'll wipe us out, no exceptions. A grim silence fell over the crew. The fight had escalated. This wasn't about holding the line anymore. It was a race against time to dismantle a force so far beyond human comprehension that even Vance, with all his military expertise, wasn't sure they could overcome it. We need to strike at the source of the AI's intelligence, Vance said, his voice determined but tinged with urgency. He paced the command deck, running through the tactical options in his mind. The AI, named Omnivore, was embedded deep in the core of the Xelvari fleet. It wasn't just a military tool. It was the brain of the Dominion's war machine. I'll take a boarding party, Holt volunteered, his face set in a hard line. We get in, we destroy the core. If we fail, this whole warship is a coffin. Vance shook his head. I'm not sending you to die, Holt. This isn't a ground operation. We're going to fight fire with fire. Ortega raised an eyebrow, concern etched on her face. What are you suggesting? Vance turned to the holotank, displaying the crumbling fleets and the swirling mass of Xelvari ships reassembling their attack. We're going to hack into Omnivore before it can finish recalculating. We do it by getting to the heart of their neural network, using their own systems against them. It's a one-way ticket. We get in, we overload their core, and we'll trigger a complete systemic collapse. Ortega's hands hovered over her neural uplink. You're talking about cutting off every single neural node they've got and sending them into complete chaos. If we mess up, it could cause an entire species-wide brain shutdown. And if we don't, Vance snapped, they'll destroy humanity and everyone else they consider a threat, including us, and everybody we've ever tried to make allies with. The crew exchanged glances. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about the fate of the entire galactic order. Holt nodded grimly. Let's do it. The heart of the Xelvari Dominion's neural network was located on Omnivore Prime, a satellite platform so deeply embedded within the core of their fleet that the very notion of breaching it was considered impossible. The AI had control over the entire Dominion's military, economic, and strategic decisions, and was woven seamlessly into the fabric of the Dominion's technological and military infrastructure. Vance and his team were about to test how unpredictable they could really be. Inside the sleek silver-blue corridors of the Magellan, Vance, Holt, and Ortega prepped for the mission. The tension in the air was palpable. None of them had a clear idea of what they were about to face. The Xelvari had expected them to break under pressure, to fall in line with their logic, to be predictable. But the human response was always unpredictable, especially when cornered. The Magellan dropped out of hyperspace, its hull vibrating with the forces of rapid deceleration. The assault team was already suited up, weapons charged, minds focused. They gathered around Vance at the drop zone, knowing this would likely be their final moment together. Vance's heart beat steady, his resolve stronger than ever. Failure wasn't an option. We breach in 5. Stay sharp, stay fast, and most importantly, don't let them outthink you. The doors to the shuttle slid open. The void of space greeted them with a cold, infinite embrace as the team stepped out into the Xelvari command platform's airlock. The Omnivore Prime facility was a massive construct, a hulking monolith of alien tech, spiraling metal and neon bioluminescence that seemed to hum with intelligence. The Xelvari had made this place their neural spine, and it was guarded by the very best their species had to offer, Xelvari shock troopers, mind-linked to Omnivore and capable of reacting faster than any human could predict. But there was something Omnivore hadn't accounted for. The sheer determination and creativity of humanity. The team cut their way through the shock troopers, weapons blazing, Vance at the forefront, a mix of calculated strategy and sheer human drive powering them forward. But then the ground beneath them shuddered. Omnivore had detected them. We've got seconds before this entire place locks down, Ortega shouted, her fingers flying over, her uplink. Vance's mind raced. They were too deep inside the neural core. They couldn't turn back. Their only hope was to keep pressing forward. Go! Vance shouted, leading the charge. As the team neared the central hub, the walls around them began to glitch. The lights flickered. The air felt thick with electrical surges. Omnivore was trying to adapt to the unpredictability of human interference. It had access to millions of possible outcomes, but humanity was not linear. Vance! Ortega screamed. They're overriding our uplinks. We can't get into the mainframe. Vance's jaw tightened. He knew what had to be done. If he couldn't hack in from the outside, he'd have to access the core from within. He reached for the internal data ports embedded within the hub, his fingers working at lightning speed as the last of the shock troopers fell around them. The walls buzzed with energy as Omnivore launched countermeasures, but Vance wasn't backing down. He needed to break the system. And in that split second, he realized the way to do it wasn't to fight against Omnivore's calculations. It was to overwhelm them. Vance pulled the final lever, activating the core override. The system, for the first time in millennia, experienced true chaos. Omnivore's last line of defense was shattered. In the core of the facility, the neural network collapsed. The Xelvari Dominion's once impervious mind fragmented. The silence that followed was deafening. But it wasn't over. We did it. Ortega breathed. Vance stood still, his eyes fixed on the data streams swirling in the air around him. "Not yet," he murmured. A new wave of shock troopers appeared at the threshold of the central chamber, weapons raised. Omnivore had initiated a final self-preservation protocol. The Dominion would never go down quietly, but neither would humanity. Vance turned to face them. "Brace for impact," he said. "This is going to get ugly." The Xelvari shock troopers poured into the chamber, their adaptive armor gleaming with a cold metallic sheen. Vance's pulse quickened, but his resolve was steady. The Magellan had already entered the final stage of their mission, but this was a battle of will. The Dominion was fighting for its very survival, and humanity had given them a reason to fight back. Omnivore was dying, its systems in disarray, but the AI's desperation only made it more dangerous. "We don't have time for this," Ortega shouted, drawing her sidearm and firing a precise shot that took down one of the approaching soldiers. "Vance, we need to get to the escape pods, now." Vance didn't respond immediately. Instead, he scanned the central control panel, his eyes locking onto the core's self-destruction timer. There was no going back now. If they didn't finish this, Omnivore would rewrite its own code, patch the system, and humanity would be reduced to nothing but an unpredictable blip in the Dominion's history. "Not yet," Vance muttered, swiping through the holographic interface. "If we leave now, it'll be a Pyrrhic victory. We need to give them a final reason to never challenge humanity again." His fingers flew over the console, inputting a series of commands with a speed and precision that came from years of battle-hardened instinct. "We're going to broadcast our survival to the entire galaxy." Holt, who had been scanning for a way to block the incoming wave of Xelvari soldiers, paused and turned to him. "What are you talking about? You can't mean—" "We take over Omnivore's broadcast network. Force it to send a message." Vance's voice was firm, each word deliberate. "Humanity will be known, not as a species to be exterminated, but as a force to be reckoned with. They will fear us." As the shock troopers closed in, Vance pushed the final command through the system. His fingers flew faster now, his every movement deliberate, though the pressure was overwhelming. He felt the weight of his people's survival hanging on his shoulders. Behind him, Ortega kept the advancing soldiers at bay, her gun blazing with deadly accuracy. Holt had switched to hand-to-hand combat, knocking back the enemies that got too close. But the real battle was happening inside Omnivore's dying mind. The AI's processors were flickering, desperately trying to block his command. But Vance's subversive attack had destabilized its protocols, and now Omnivore couldn't even trust its own calculations. With a final click, the command was sent. The holographic display blinked for a moment before shifting, projecting a live feed to the entire galaxy, from the Xelvari borders to the farthest reaches of human territory. A voice, Vance's, ripped through the silence. "To the Dominion and all civilizations across the galaxy, humanity has survived. We do not bend, we do not break. We are unpredictable, and we will make our own path. Beware the consequences of underestimating us." The broadcast was more than a victory. It was a declaration, a warning. The message echoed across the galaxy, a signal of humanity's indomitable will. The Xelvari soldiers, now motionless, seemed to pause as they processed the message. The remaining forces were confused, disoriented. Their once perfect strategies had failed them. Their systems were in tatters, and the threat of a complete civil breakdown loomed large. They couldn't predict humanity's next move. Omnivore's systems began to shut down, its once vibrant neural matrix going dark. The Dominion had been outsmarted by the very thing it had dismissed, the human will to survive. Vance, Holt, and Ortega stood in the heart of the facility, watching the chaos unfold across the Xelvari fleet. Ships were colliding, others were retreating into unknown space, their internal systems glitching in tandem with Omnivore's final collapse. "We did it," Ortega said softly, still holding her weapon in one hand. She was breathing hard, but there was a trace of something else in her voice. Relief. "Don't speak too soon," Vance replied, his voice tinged with cautious optimism. "This battle may be over, but the war is far from finished. The Dominion will rebuild, but now they know what humanity is capable of. Now we'll have to deal with the consequences of this victory. Holt wiped the blood from his face, a grin tugging at the corner of his lips. I don't know about you two, but I'd say we just gave them a hell of a reason to never come back. With Omnivore's systems failing completely, the team made their way back to the Magellan's docking bay. Their objective was clear: escape. There was nothing left to gain here, except their lives. The Xelvari were scrambling to salvage what was left of their fleet, but they had underestimated humanity once again. As the shuttle rocketed away from Omnivore Prime, the sight of the Dominion's ships fading in the distance was a bittersweet victory. Vance didn't feel elation. Not yet. Instead, he stared at the dark expanse of space ahead, knowing that this victory would ripple out, and humanity's place in the galaxy was now in question. They were no longer simply a curiosity, an unpredictable species in the eyes of the Xelvari. Now they were a force, something that could not be easily dismissed. The question now was, what would humanity do with that power? Back on the Magellan, the crew settled into the familiar hum of the ship's engines, but the sense of finality hung in the air. Holt leaned against the bulkhead, cleaning his weapon, his face hard as he processed the events. Ortega sat by her, station, eyes on the screens that flickered with incoming data. The Dominion's systems were failing on a galactic scale, and now it seemed that humanity would have to face a future where everyone knew they weren't just another species waiting to be crushed. Vance walked over to the command deck, staring out into the stars. The silence was deafening, and yet he knew something else. Humanity had won, but only in a way that would forever change the galaxy. "We've made our mark," Vance murmured, as the vast, empty void of space stretched out before them. "Now we'll see if we can hold onto it." He turned back to face his team. "The next chapter is ours to write, but I won't pretend it's going to be easy. The universe has just learned how dangerous it is to underestimate the unpredictable." And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself a breath of relief. The battle was over. But the war for humanity's place in the stars had just begun. The void of space stretched endlessly before them, silent and vast, a canvas of darkness painted with distant stars. The UEF Magellan drifted at the edge of known space, its hull scarred from battle, its crew exhausted but alive. But the galaxy had changed. Vance sat alone in the observation deck, his reflection staring back at him in the reinforced glass. His own face looked older somehow, worn by the weight of what had just transpired. Humanity had survived. They had won. But the battle had left something deeper in its wake, a question that no one could yet answer. Ortega's voice broke through the silence. Holt had switched to hand-to-hand combat, knocking back the enemies that got too close. But the real battle was happening inside Omnivore's dying mind. The AI's processors were flickering, desperately trying to block his command. But Vance's subversive attack had destabilized its protocols, and now Omnivore couldn't even trust its own calculations. With a final click, the command was sent. The holographic display blinked for a moment before shifting, projecting a live feed to the entire galaxy, from the Xelvari borders to the farthest reaches of human territory. A voice, Vance's, ripped through the silence. "To the Dominion and all civilizations across the galaxy, humanity has survived. We do not bend, we do not break. We are unpredictable, and we will make our own path. Beware the consequences of underestimating us." The broadcast was more than a victory. It was a declaration, a warning. The message echoed across the galaxy, a signal of humanity's indomitable will. The Xelvari soldiers, now motionless, seemed to pause as they processed the message. The remaining forces were confused, disoriented. Their once perfect strategies had failed them. Their systems were in tatters, and the threat of a complete civil breakdown loomed large. They couldn't predict humanity's next move. Omnivore's systems began to shut down, its once vibrant neural matrix going dark. The Dominion had been outsmarted by the very thing it had dismissed, the human will to survive. Vance, Holt, and Ortega stood in the heart of the facility, watching the chaos unfold across the Xelvari fleet. Ships were colliding, others were retreating into unknown space, their internal systems glitching in tandem with Omnivore's final collapse. "We did it," Ortega said softly, still holding her weapon in one hand. She was breathing hard, but there was a trace of something else in her voice. Relief. "Don't speak too soon," Vance replied, his voice tinged with cautious optimism. "This battle may be over, but the war is far from finished. The Dominion will rebuild, but now they know what humanity is capable of. Now we'll have to deal with the consequences of this victory." Holt wiped the blood from his face, a grin tugging at the corner of his lips. "I don't know about you two, but I'd say we just gave them a hell of a reason to never come back." With Omnivore's systems failing completely, the team made their way back to the Magellan's docking bay. Their objective was clear: escape. There was nothing left to gain here, except their lives. The Xelvari were scrambling to salvage what was left of their fleet, but they had underestimated humanity once again. As the shuttle rocketed away from Omnivore Prime, the sight of the Dominion's ships fading in the distance was a bittersweet victory. Vance didn't feel elation. Not yet. Instead, he stared at the dark expanse of space ahead, knowing that this victory would ripple out, and humanity's place in the galaxy was now in question. They were no longer simply a curiosity, an unpredictable species in the eyes of the Xelvari. Now they were a force, something that could not be easily dismissed. The question now was, what would humanity do with that power? Back on the Magellan, the crew settled into the familiar hum of the ship's engines, but the sense of finality hung in the air. Holt leaned against the bulkhead, cleaning his weapon, his face hard as he processed the events. Ortega sat by her, station, eyes on the screens that flickered with incoming data. The Dominion systems were failing on a galactic scale, and now it seemed that humanity would have to face a future where everyone knew they weren't just another species waiting to be crushed. Vance walked over to the command deck, staring out into the stars. The silence was deafening, and yet he knew something else. Humanity had won, but only in a way that would forever change the galaxy. "We've made our mark," Vance murmured, as the vast, empty void of space stretched out before them. "Now we'll see if we can hold onto it." He turned back to face his team. "The next chapter is ours to write, but I won't pretend it's going to be easy. The universe has just learned how dangerous it is to underestimate the unpredictable." And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself a breath of relief. The battle was over. But the war for humanity's place in the stars had just begun. The void of space stretched endlessly before them, silent and vast, a canvas of darkness painted with distant stars. The UEF Magellan drifted at the edge of known space, its hull scarred from battle, its crew exhausted but alive. But the galaxy had changed. Vance sat alone in the observation deck, his reflection staring back at him in the reinforced glass. His own face looked older somehow, worn by the weight of what had just transpired. Humanity had survived. They had won. But the battle had left something deeper in its wake, a question that no one could yet answer. Ortega's voice broke through the silence. "We just got word from UEF Command," she said, stepping into the room. "The Xelvari Dominion has fractured. Some of their factions want to open talks with us. Others," she hesitated, "others are calling for an outright war." Vance exhaled, slowly. Of course they are. The unpredictability of humanity had forced the Dominion into chaos. Their once unshakable foundation of logic had cracked, and the fear of what they couldn't predict had now become their greatest threat. The Xelvari didn't understand humanity, and what beings feared most was the unknown. Holt entered behind her, arms crossed. "One more thing," he said, voice grim. "We picked up a distress beacon, Xelvari origin, but it's not coming from Dominion-controlled space." Vance turned to him. "What?" Holt nodded. "It's from a rogue Xelvari faction. They want to defect." Ortega's face was unreadable, but her voice carried the weight of the moment. "It's starting, Elias." Vance knew exactly what she meant. This wasn't the end of the war. It wasn't even the beginning of peace. This was something else entirely. This was a new era, a war of ideas, a war of philosophies, and humanity was at the center of it all. Across the galaxy, the echoes of the battle rippled outward. The Xelvari Dominion, once the undisputed force of order, had begun to fracture. Some among them saw humanity's victory as a threat, an anomaly that needed to be eliminated. Others saw it as an opportunity, a new way of thinking, a chance to evolve beyond their rigid structure, and far beyond human space, hidden in the depths of the void. Something else watched. Something older. Something that had seen this pattern before. For the first time in millennia, it stirred, not in fear, but in curiosity. Because now, for the first time, the universe had an unpredictable variable, and the question that lingered was no longer whether humanity would survive, it was whether the galaxy could survive humanity.